She tried to flee the wedding carriage, but the Duke inside whispered, "You're safe now." The rain fell mercilessly upon the crumbling stone steps of Vale Manor as Liora gathered the sodden silk of her wedding gown in trembling hands. The fabric, once pristine white, now muddied and torn, clung to her frame like a prison of lace and broken promises. Behind her, the muffled sounds of celebration continued, oblivious to the bride's desperate flight. "Miss Vale!" Mrs. Whitcomb's voice carried across the courtyard. "Miss Vale, you cannot—" Liora did not turn. The elderly housekeeper had been kind, but kindness would not save her from what awaited inside. Lord Varnell's leering smile, her father's whiskey-soaked indifference, and the mountain of debt that had transformed her from daughter to currency. The arrangement had been made with brutal efficiency, her hand for her father's gambling debts. "I will not be sold," she whispered, her words lost to the howling wind. Across the rain-lashed grounds a carriage waited. Its black, lacquered surface gleamed wetly in the faint light spilling from the manor windows. The crest upon its door was obscured by shadows, not Varnell's then. Perhaps a wedding guest departing early, or a merchant lost on these remote roads. It mattered not. Any fate was preferable to becoming Lady Varnell. Liora gathered her remaining courage and ran, her silk slippers sinking into the mud with each desperate step. Behind her, voices grew louder. Her absence had been noted. Soon they would come for her, Varnell's men with their rough hands and rougher words. The carriage was her only hope. The door handle was cold beneath her fingers. She wrenched it open without hesitation, prepared to beg, to offer what little money she had secreted away in her grandmother's locket. But the words died upon her lips. A man sat within, his features half hidden in shadow. "Please," she began, but faltered as he leaned forward, lamplight catching the sharp planes of his face. "Miss Vale, I presume." His voice was low and measured, aristocratic in its precision. Recognition dawned with terrible clarity. The Duke of Carthorne, whose name was whispered in drawing-rooms across England with equal parts fear and fascination. Dorian Carthorne, whose cold gaze was said to have reduced hardened soldiers to silence, whose wealth was surpassed only by his ruthlessness. "Your Grace," she gasped, attempting a curtsy even as rain soaked through her gown. "Forgive me, I did not—" "Get in," he commanded, his tone brooking no argument. Liora hesitated, one foot upon the carriage step. Behind her, she heard Varnell's unmistakable bellow. "Find her! The little fool cannot have gone far." The Duke's grey eyes followed her gaze toward the manor. Something unreadable flickered across his features. "They come for you," he observed. "Your choice, Miss Vale. Them or me." "No choice at all, then." Liora climbed into the carriage, her wedding gown a sudden weight of wet silk and broken dreams. The Duke rapped upon the roof with his walking stick, and the carriage lurched forward into the storm. They sat in silence, separated by shadows and the narrow confines of velvet upholstery. Liora clutched her grandmother's locket, her heart thrumming with renewed terror. What had she done? To flee one monster, only to find herself in the company of another, for surely that was what the Duke of Carthorne must be. His reputation preceded him, widowed under mysterious circumstances, reclusive to the point of legend, with a fortune built upon the broken fortunes of others. Lightning illuminated his face, hawkish, severe, beautiful in its cold perfection, a face that revealed nothing while observing everything. "You are running from Lord Varnell," he stated, not a question but a verdict. "I cannot marry him." The words spilled forth unbidden, desperate in their honesty. "And yet a marriage contract was signed, by your father's hand, if my information is correct." Liora's throat tightened. "My father's debts are not mine to pay." "The law would disagree, Miss Vale." The carriage rattled over uneven ground, each jolt bringing them farther from Vale Manor, and closer to whatever fate the Duke had planned. Why was he here, on her wedding day? What purpose could the Duke of Carthorne have with the daughter of a ruined country gentleman? "Where are you taking me?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. The Duke regarded her thoughtfully, his gloved fingers tapping against his walking stick. "Away," he said simply. Liora's courage, already frayed, finally broke. In one desperate motion, she lunged for the door handle, prepared to throw herself into the storm rather than remain in this prison of mahogany and uncertainty. "Stop!" His hand closed around her wrist, surprisingly gentle despite its firmness. "Miss Vale, Liora, you misunderstand." She froze, trapped between his grasp and the door. The Duke released her slowly, as one might release a frightened bird. When he spoke again, his voice had softened to a whisper that seemed to fill the carriage despite its quietness. "You're safe now." 3 words, impossible in their simplicity, inconceivable from such a man. Yet something in his eyes, grey as winter seas, compelled her to believe them. The carriage door remained unopened. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing away the footprints of her flight. Dawn broke reluctantly over Carethorne Hall, painting its austere stone facade with pallid light. Liora stood at the window of her appointed chamber, watching as morning mist curled around the formal gardens below. She had slept fitfully, plagued by dreams of Varnell's hands and her father's indifferent gaze. The Duke's household had received her without question. A silent maid had provided nightclothes. A stern-faced housekeeper had shown her to this room with its heavy oak furniture and faded tapestries. She had seen nothing of the Duke since their arrival in the dead of night. His parting words had been sparse. "Rest, we shall speak when you are recovered." Recovered from what? The humiliation of fleeing her own wedding? The shock of finding herself under the protection, if protection it truly was, of England's most notorious peer? A knock interrupted her thoughts. The maid, Agnes, entered with a breakfast tray and a gown of pale blue wool, simple but well made and decidedly not hers. "His Grace requests your presence in the library when you are prepared, miss," Agnes said, setting down the tray. "Whose gown is this?" Liora asked, touching the soft fabric. "It belonged to the late Duchess, miss." Liora withdrew her hand as though burned. "I cannot wear the clothing of a dead woman." "His Grace instructed that you be properly attired." Agnes's tone softened marginally. "The Duchess has been gone these 7 years, miss. The gown has never been worn." What choice did she have? Her wedding dress lay ruined, a sodden heap of silk and lace. With reluctant acquiescence, Liora allowed Agnes to help her dress. The gown fit surprisingly well, requiring only minimal adjustments at the waist. As Agnes arranged her hair in a simple chignon, Liora studied her reflection. The woman who stared back seemed a stranger, composed where she felt only confusion, dignified where she felt only fear. The library occupied the east wing of Carethorne Hall, its tall windows overlooking the wild cliffs beyond the formal gardens. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, interrupted only by a massive stone fireplace, where flames crackled against the morning's chill. The Duke stood before it, his tall frame silhouetted against the light. "Your Grace," Liora said, dropping into a curtsy despite her trembling knees. "You wished to see me." He turned, and she was struck again by the severe beauty of his features. In daylight she could see that his black hair was touched with silver at the temples, though he could not be much past 30. His eyes, the color of rain-washed slate, appraised her with quiet intensity. "The gown suits you," he observed. "Please sit." Liora perched on the edge of a leather armchair, her back rigid with tension. "I must thank you for your intervention yesterday, Your Grace, though I confess I do not understand it." "No?" He took the seat opposite her. "I should think my actions were quite clear. I removed you from an untenable situation. Why would the Duke of Carethorne concern himself with the troubles of a stranger?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Are we strangers, Miss Vale? Your father and I have had business dealings for many years. I am well acquainted with his proclivities." Heat flooded Liora's cheeks. "My father's weaknesses are no secret, it seems." "Indeed not." The Duke's tone remained even, devoid of judgment. "Lord Varnell has been acquiring your father's debts systematically for the past year. A most unusual investment strategy, would you not agree?" Liora's hands clenched in her lap. "He wanted me. The debts were merely his means of acquisition." "Precisely." The Duke leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Varnell's appetites are well known in certain circles. His first 2 wives met with unfortunate ends, and so you rescued me from becoming the third." Liora lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. "Again, I ask, why?" For a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackle of flames in the hearth. When the Duke finally spoke, his voice carried an emotion she could not name. "I knew your mother, Miss Vale. Before her marriage to your father, she was—" He paused, choosing his words with evident care. "She was kind to me, at a time when kindness was a rarity in my life." Surprise rendered Liora momentarily speechless. Her mother had died when she was but 10 years old, leaving only fading memories of gentle hands and whispered stories. "You knew my mother," she repeated softly, "yet she never spoke of you." She would not have. Something in his expression closed, like shutters against a storm. "It was long ago and of no consequence now. What matters is that I could not stand idle while her daughter was sacrificed to a man like Varnell. The door opened before Liora could respond. A tall man with the bearing of a soldier entered, his expression grave. "Your Grace, forgive the interruption." His eyes darted briefly to Liora. "A messenger has arrived from London. Lord Varnell has filed formal charges of breach of contract and theft." The Duke showed no reaction, save for a slight tightening of his jaw. "Thank you, Blackwood. Have the messenger await my response." When the door closed, Liora rose shakily to her feet. "Theft? What could I possibly have stolen?" "Yourself, Miss Vale." The Duke's voice was grim. "In the eyes of the law, you were Varnell's property from the moment your father signed the marriage contract." "That cannot be." "It is." He stood, towering over her. "But do not concern yourself. I have some influence in legal circles. This will be resolved." "At what cost to yourself?" Liora asked, suddenly aware of the risk he had undertaken. "Your reputation—" "My reputation," he interrupted, "is already beyond redemption. A fact I have long since accepted." He crossed to a writing desk and extracted a small silver key from his waistcoat pocket. The lock of a drawer yielded with a soft click. "This belonged to your mother," he said, returning with something clutched in his hand. "I believe she would wish you to have it now." Into her palm he placed a small ivory miniature, no larger than a pocket watch. Within its circular frame, a likeness of her mother smiled softly, her eyes holding the same gentle wisdom Liora remembered. "How did you come to possess this?" she whispered. The Duke's expression remained inscrutable. "She entrusted it to me, with instructions to keep it safe until it might be needed." His fingers brushed against hers as he closed her hand around the miniature, much like her daughter. The door opened once more. Agnes stood on the threshold, her usually impassive face troubled. "Your Grace," she said, her voice unnaturally high. "Riders approaching from the South Road, Lord Varnell's livery." The Duke's response was immediate. "Blackwood!" His call brought the soldier-like man hurrying back. "Secure the house. No one enters without my express command." To Liora he offered his arm with sudden urgency. "Come, there is somewhere you will be safe." She hesitated only a moment before placing her hand upon his sleeve. As he led her from the library, the ivory miniature pressed against her palm like a talisman. Outside, beyond the tall windows, storm clouds gathered once more over Carethorne Hall. The passageway descended in a tight spiral, stone steps worn smooth by generations of feet. Liora followed the Duke's tall figure, one hand clutching the miniature, the other trailing along the damp wall for balance. The only illumination came from the lantern he carried, its flickering light casting monstrous shadows that danced and swayed with their movement. "These passages were built during the Wars of the Roses," the Duke explained, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "My ancestors found it prudent to have means of escape, when loyalty to the wrong rose might mean death." They emerged into a small chamber hewn from the living rock beneath Carethorne Hall. Bookshelves lined one wall, a narrow bed occupied another, and a hearth with a chimney cleverly disguised as part of the cliff face provided warmth. It was a scholar's retreat, not a prison cell, as Liora had half feared. "No one will find you here," the Duke said, lighting additional lamps that transformed the space from forbidding to merely austere. "Even most of my staff are unaware of its existence." "How long must I remain hidden?" Liora asked, the reality of her situation settling like a stone upon her heart. A fugitive in the home of a man whose motives remained opaque, despite his claimed connection to her mother. The Duke set down the lantern and regarded her with those rain-grey eyes. "Until I can ensure your safety by legal means. Days, perhaps, no more than a fortnight. And if Lord Varnell should discover me here, what then?" "He will not." The certainty in his voice was absolute. "But should the impossible occur, there is a second passage." He indicated a bookshelf. "The third volume from the left on the second shelf. Pull it, and a door will open to a tunnel that leads to the cliffs. Follow it to its end, and you will find a cottage where my groundskeeper lives. He can be trusted." Liora nodded, committing the instructions to memory even as she prayed they would never be needed. "I must return above before my absence is noted," the Duke continued. "Blackwood knows of this place. If you have need of anything, pull this bell cord." He indicated a nearly invisible cord beside the bed. "He will come. Wait." Liora caught his sleeve as he turned to leave, surprising herself with her boldness. "Your Grace, what will you tell Lord Varnell?" A smile touched his lips, transforming his severe features into something almost kind. "The truth, Miss Vale, that I have not seen you since the night of your wedding." He covered her hand briefly with his own. "Rest now. You are safe here." With that he was gone, taking the lantern, and leaving her alone with the soft glow of the remaining lamps. Liora explored her sanctuary, finding it better appointed than first appearances suggested. The bookshelves held volumes of poetry, history, and natural philosophy. A small desk contained paper, ink, and quills. The narrow bed was made up with linen sheets that smelled of lavender. Someone, Agnes perhaps, had anticipated her needs. She opened the miniature of her mother, studying the familiar face that gazed back at her. What connection had existed between this gentle woman and the austere Duke of Carthorne? What debt did he feel he owed that would prompt him to risk his position and reputation for her daughter? A distant commotion above broke her reverie. Muffled voices, the sound of boots upon stone floors. Lord Varnell had arrived. Hours passed in tense solitude. Liora attempted to distract herself with books, but found her mind returning incessantly to the confrontation occurring somewhere above her head. She paced the small chamber, counting steps to occupy her racing thoughts. 12 from the bed to the hearth, 8 from the hearth to the bookshelf with its secret escape route, 20 around the perimeter of the room. She was midway through her third circuit when the scrape of stone against stone announced someone's arrival. Liora backed toward the bookshelf, ready to flee, but relaxed when Blackwood's stern face appeared in the doorway. "Miss Vale," he said with a slight bow. "His Grace instructed me to inform you that Lord Varnell has departed. The immediate danger has passed." "What transpired?" Liora asked. "Did he accept the Duke's denial?" Blackwood's expression remained impassive. "I am not at liberty to discuss the particulars of their conversation. However, I can assure you that Lord Varnell left Carthorne Hall alive and unharmed, if somewhat diminished in spirits." The careful phrasing sent a chill down Leora's spine. What manner of exchange could leave a man like Varnell diminished in spirits? "The Duke requests your presence in the library, if you feel equal to the climb," Blackwood continued. "There have been developments you should be made aware of." Leora's heart quickened. "Of course, please lead the way." The Duke stood at the library window when they entered, his tall frame silhouetted against the fading afternoon light. He turned at their approach, and Liora was shocked by his appearance. Though his clothing remained impeccable, his face bore evidence of recent strain, a tightness around his eyes, a tension in his jaw that had not been present before. "Miss Vale," he acknowledged, dismissing Blackwood with a nod. "You are well?" "Yes, Your Grace." She moved further into the room. "Your man indicated there were developments." "Indeed." He gestured to a chair. "Please, sit. This may take some explanation." Liora obeyed, watching as he poured 2 glasses of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. He offered one to her, his eyebrow raising slightly when she accepted without hesitation. "Lord Varnell is a persistent man," the Duke began, taking the seat opposite her, "and as I discovered today, exceedingly well connected within the magistracy. The charges he has filed will not be easily dismissed." Leora's fingers tightened around her glass. "What does this mean for me?" "It means," he said carefully, "that we must adopt a more definitive strategy than I had initially planned." "What strategy could possibly—" "Marriage," he interrupted, his voice matter-of-fact. "To me." The word hung in the air between them, impossible and absolute. Liora stared at him, certain she had misheard. "Your Grace, surely you cannot—" "I assure you I can." He leaned forward, his expression intense. "Hear me out, Miss Vale. As a married woman, as my wife, you would be beyond Varnell's reach. The contract with your father would be rendered void. Your debts would become mine, and I assure you I can well afford them." "But—" Liora struggled to form coherent thoughts. "This is madness. You know nothing of me." "I know you are Elizabeth Vale's daughter," he replied simply. "I know you had the courage to flee a fate many women would have accepted. I know you have conducted yourself with dignity despite circumstances that would break lesser spirits." He paused. "I believe I know enough." Liora rose shakily to her feet, needing distance from his overwhelming presence. "And what would you gain from such an arrangement, Your Grace? Surely not the pleasure of my company, nor the advantage of my non-existent dowry." Something flashed in his eyes, something that might have been pain in a man less controlled. "What I gain is not your concern. If you ask me to be your wife, it most certainly is my concern." Anger gave her courage. "I will not exchange one prison for another, no matter how gilded the bars." The Duke stood, closing the distance between them with 2 long strides. "Is that what you believe I offer? A prison?" His voice was low, dangerous. "I offer you safety, Miss Vale. I offer you freedom from Varnell, from your father, from the creditors who would see you sold to satisfy their ledgers." "At what price?" she whispered. For a moment he said nothing, studying her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. Then, with deliberate care, he removed a folded document from his coat pocket. "Read it," he said, holding it out to her, "before you decide." Liora took the paper with trembling fingers. It was a marriage contract, drawn up in precise legal language. As she scanned its contents, her eyes widened in disbelief. "This provides for my complete financial independence," she said, looking up at him, "and," she faltered, "and specifies that the marriage need not be consummated." "As I said." His voice was very quiet now. "I offer you freedom, Miss Vale, not imprisonment." "Why?" The question escaped before she could stop it. "Why would you do this?" The Duke turned away, his profile sharp against the gathering dusk. For a long moment, Liora thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his words were so soft she had to strain to hear them. "Because no one did it for your mother." Before she could respond, a commotion erupted in the hallway outside. Raised voices, the sound of running feet. The library door burst open, revealing a disheveled Blackwood, blood streaming from a cut above his eye. "Your Grace," he gasped. "They've returned. Varnell and the magistrate. They have a warrant." The Duke's reaction was immediate. His hand closed around Leora's wrist, his eyes burning with sudden urgency. "Decide now," he said. "Marriage or flight. There is no more time." Liora looked from his face to the contract still clutched in her hand, her mind racing with impossible choices. Outside the library windows, the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. "I choose marriage," Liora said, the words falling from her lips before reason could intercede. "I choose you." Relief flashed across the Duke's face. So briefly she might have imagined it, before his features settled into resolute determination. "Blackwood, how much time?" "Minutes only, Your Grace." They approached the main gate. The Duke nodded sharply. "Summon Reverend Hartley from the chapel. Bring him to the east drawing-room immediately." To Liora he extended his hand. "Come, we must be swift if this is to succeed." She placed her trembling fingers in his, the marriage contract still clutched in her other hand. As they hurried through the shadowed corridors of Carthorne Hall, the distant sound of thundering hooves grew louder. The storm had arrived in more ways than one. The east drawing-room was a small chamber, intimate compared to the grandeur of the library. Dust covers shrouded most of the furniture, giving the impression of a room long abandoned. The Duke swept one cover from a delicate writing desk, sending motes of dust dancing in the lamplight. "Sign," he instructed, producing an inkwell and pen from a drawer. "Your full name, as it appears at the top of the document." Liora bent to the task, her signature flowing across the parchment in elegant script. Liora Elizabeth Vale. As she straightened, the door opened to admit a thin man in clerical garb, his expression one of bewildered concern. "Your Grace," the Reverend began, "what is the meaning of—" "We require your services for a marriage ceremony," the Duke interrupted. "Immediately." The clergyman blinked rapidly. "A marriage? But the banns have not been—" "Special license." The Duke produced another document from his coat, signed by the Archbishop himself. Liora stared at him in astonishment. How long had he been planning this? The license must have been obtained days ago, perhaps even before their first meeting. The implications sent her mind reeling. "This is most irregular," Reverend Hartley protested, though his fingers reached automatically for the license. "Necessity often is." The Duke's tone brooked no argument. "Proceed, Reverend. There is little time." What followed was the strangest wedding ceremony in the annals of Carthorne Hall. No flowers adorned the dusty room, no music swelled to mark the solemnity of the occasion. Liora wore the late Duchess's blue gown, the Duke his everyday attire. Blackwood stood as witness, blood still drying on his temple. Outside, rain lashed the windows as if nature itself objected to their hasty union. "Dearly beloved," the Reverend began, his voice gaining strength as he fell into the familiar rhythm of the marriage service. "We are gathered here in the sight of God." Liora heard the words as if from a great distance. Her hand remained clasped in the Duke's larger one, his skin warm against her cold fingers. Was this truly happening? Was she binding herself to this enigmatic man whose motives remained as shadowed as his past? "Wilt thou have this woman to thy wedded wife?" "I will," the Duke answered, his deep voice steady. "Wilt thou have this man to thy wedded husband?" Leora's response caught in her throat. In the silence that followed, she felt the Duke's eyes upon her, patient despite the urgency that had precipitated this moment. Beyond the walls of the drawing-room, the sound of voices could be heard. Varnell and his men had entered Carthorne Hall. "I will," she whispered at last. The exchange of vows continued with haste, the Reverend stumbling slightly over passages in his nervous rush. When the moment came for a ring, the Duke hesitated for the first time since this mad scheme began. "I had not anticipated," he began. "Allow me, Your Grace." Blackwood stepped forward, removing a plain gold band from his little finger. "My late wife's. She would have wished it used for a worthy purpose." The Duke accepted the offering with a nod of gratitude. As he slid the ring onto Liora's finger, too large but sufficient for the ceremony, their eyes met. In his gaze she saw not triumph, but a solemn promise. "Those whom God hath joined together, let no man put asunder," the Reverend intoned. The words had scarcely left his lips when the drawing-room door burst open. Lord Varnell stood on the threshold, his corpulent frame heaving with exertion, his florid face contorted with rage. Behind him loomed a thin man in magistrate's robes, clutching a rolled document that could only be the warrant. "Seize her," Varnell bellowed, pointing a trembling finger at Liora. "She is my property by law and contract." "I fear you are mistaken, my lord." The Duke's voice was ice, his posture subtly shifting to place himself between Liora and the intruders. "May I present my wife, the Duchess of Carthorne?" Varnell's mouth opened and closed like a fish deprived of water. "Impossible," he sputtered. "The contract is superseded by a marriage contract and the sacred vows we have just exchanged." The Duke gestured to the Reverend, who clutched his prayer book to his chest as if it might shield him from Varnell's wrath. "Is that not so, Reverend Hartley?" "Indeed, Your Grace," the Reverend confirmed, finding unexpected courage. "The ceremony was conducted according to all legal and spiritual requirements. The lady is now your Duchess in the eyes of both God and Crown." The magistrate stepped forward, his thin face troubled. "Is this true, Your Grace? You have married Miss Vale of your own free will?" "I have." The Duke's hand found Liora's, his thumb brushing reassuringly over the borrowed ring. "And she has accepted me with equal freedom of choice. Your warrant, sir, is now without foundation." "This is outrageous." Varnell's face purpled dangerously. "The girl was promised to me. I paid good money for her hand." "A transaction I have rendered void," the Duke replied calmly. "However, I am prepared to compensate you for your investment. Blackwood, see that Lord Varnell receives a draft for the full amount of the Vale debts, with interest." Varnell's expression shifted, greed momentarily overcoming his anger. "The full amount, plus 10% for your inconvenience." The Duke's smile did not reach his eyes. "Provided you depart Carthorne Hall immediately and withdraw all charges against my wife." A tense silence followed, broken only by the steady drumming of rain against the windows. The magistrate cleared his throat awkwardly. "The law is clear in this matter, Lord Varnell. If Miss Vale, that is her Grace, is legally married, your contract with her father is rendered null." Varnell's gaze darted between Liora, the Duke, and the promise of financial restitution. His shoulders sagged in defeat. "Very well," he muttered, his voice thick with resentment. "But do not imagine this concludes our business, Carthorne." "On the contrary," the Duke replied, "I consider all business between us permanently concluded. Good day, my lord." When Varnell and the magistrate had been escorted from the premises, Liora released a breath she had not realized she was holding. The Reverend, sensing his role was complete, made hasty excuses and departed, leaving her alone with the man who was now, incredibly, her husband. "It is done," the Duke said quietly. "You are safe." Liora looked down at the borrowed ring on her finger, the reality of what had transpired finally settling upon her like a weight. "What happens now, Your Grace?" "Now," he said, a weariness entering his voice, "we learn to live with the consequences of our hasty bargain." He released her hand gently. "And perhaps, given our new circumstances, you might consider calling me Dorian." Before she could respond, the borrowed ring slipped from her finger and fell to the floor with a soft clink. As both reached to retrieve it, their hands met over the small circle of gold, a momentary touch that held the promise and peril of their uncertain future. A fortnight passed at Carthorne Hall, days marked by rain and silence. Liora moved through the vast house like a ghost, learning its passages and peculiarities, rarely encountering its master. The Duke, Dorian, though she had not yet summoned the courage to address him thus, seemed determined to honor the letter of their arrangement by maintaining a respectful distance. Their paths crossed primarily at dinner, a formal affair conducted in the cavernous dining room where footmen stood at attention, and conversation remained limited to polite inquiries about her comfort. By day she explored the extensive library or walked the cliffside gardens when weather permitted. By night she retired to the Duchess's chambers, a suite of rooms adjacent to, but separate from, the Duke's own apartments. A marriage in name only, just as the contract had specified. Yet Liora found herself increasingly curious about the man who had rescued her from Varnell's clutches. What sorrows lurked behind those storm-grey eyes? What connection to her mother drove him to such extraordinary measures for her protection? On this particular morning, restlessness led her to the portrait gallery, a long corridor lined with generations of Carethorn ancestors. Stern-faced men and serene women gazed down from gilded frames, a visual history of power and privilege. Near the end hung a portrait of a woman whose gentle beauty seemed at odds with her surroundings, the late Duchess, Liora presumed. "Eleanor," a voice confirmed from behind her. "My wife." Liora turned to find Dorian standing in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the light. It was the first time he had sought her company voluntarily. "She was very beautiful," Liora observed, studying the painted face with its delicate features and sad eyes. "Yes." He moved to stand beside her, his gaze fixed on the portrait. Though the artist failed to capture her spirit, she was vibrant until the end. The unspoken question hung between them. Liora hesitated, uncertain if she dared breach the wall of formality he maintained so rigidly. "How did she die?" she asked finally, her voice soft. For a moment, she thought he would not answer. His profile remained impassive, carved from stone. "Childbirth," he said at last. "She and our son. 7 years ago." "I am sorry," Liora whispered, the inadequacy of the words burning in her throat. "Truly," he inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her sympathy without meeting her eyes. "It was a long time ago. Yet you have not remarried. Until now, that is." The observation escaped before she could reconsider its wisdom. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Until now, though our arrangement hardly constitutes a traditional marriage." "No," Liora agreed. "It does not." She gathered her courage. "Your Grace, Dorian, I have wondered why you did not simply offer me a position as companion or ward. Surely that would have been sufficient protection without the complication of marriage." He turned to her then, his expression unreadable. "Would it? Varnell could still have pressed his claim against your father's contract. As my ward, you would remain vulnerable. As my wife, you are untouchable. Even so, the sacrifice seems extreme." Liora met his gaze directly. "I cannot help but wonder what you gain from this arrangement." Something flickered in his eyes, a shadow of emotion quickly suppressed. "Perhaps I grow weary of solitude." "I think not," she replied. "You have maintained your solitude quite effectively, despite our matrimonial state." His eyebrow arched in surprise at her boldness. "You find fault with my hospitality?" "Not at all. You have been most generous." Liora gestured to her gown of fine green silk, another from the late Duchess's wardrobe. "I want for nothing material, yet I cannot help but feel I am merely trading one form of invisibility for another." The words hung between them, challenging in their honesty. Dorian studied her face as if seeing her truly for the first time. "What would you have of me?" he asked, his voice low. "Truth," she answered simply. "You claim to know my mother. Tell me how." He turned back to Eleanor's portrait, his hands clasped behind his back. For a long moment Liora thought he would deny her this small request. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of memory. "I was 19 when I first met Elizabeth Vale. She was governess to my young cousins at Thornfield Estate, and I was a second son with no prospects save a military commission." His eyes remained fixed on the painting, but Liora sensed he saw something else entirely. "She was kind to a young man consumed by his own insignificance. She saw worth where others saw only a spare heir." "You loved her," Liora realized, the revelation stealing her breath. "I admired her," he corrected gently. "She was several years my senior and possessed of a wisdom I sorely lacked. When I received orders to join my regiment in India, she gave me that miniature you now possess, with instructions to return it to her should fortune ever bring us together again. But it never did. No, by the time I returned to England, my brother had died, leaving me the title and estates. Your mother had married your father and removed to Vale Manor." A shadow crossed his features. "I learned later that it was not a happy union." "It was not," Liora confirmed, memories of her father's drunken rages rising unbidden. "Though my mother never spoke of it, she protected me from the worst of his nature." "As she would." Dorian's voice softened. "When I heard of her death, I made inquiries about her daughter. I discovered that Robert Vale had squandered most of your inheritance and was rapidly descending into debauchery. I kept watch from a distance. When I learned of the contract with Varnell," he broke off, his jaw tightening. I could not allow it. The pieces aligned in Liora's mind, his unexpected appearance at her wedding, the prepared documents, the hidden chamber, all arranged in anticipation of her flight. You planned my rescue from the beginning. I prepared for the possibility, he acknowledged, though I had hoped to find a less permanent solution than marriage. Then you do regret our arrangement. The thought brought an unexpected pang of disappointment. Dorian turned to her, his expression grave. I regret only that circumstances forced such a choice upon you. My aim was to secure your freedom, not to replace one form of bondage with another. A commotion in the corridor interrupted their conversation. Raised voices, the sound of hurried footsteps. Blackwood appeared in the doorway, his usual composure disturbed. Your Grace, he said, bowing slightly. A messenger has arrived from Vale Manor. It seems Lord Vale has suffered an apoplexy. The doctors fear he may not survive the night. Liora's heart contracted painfully. Despite everything, Robert Vale remained her father. I must go to him. Out of the question, Dorian replied immediately. Varnell's men will be watching for any opportunity to seize you. Vale Manor is the first place they would look. He is my father, Liora insisted, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. Whatever his failings, I cannot abandon him in his final hours. Dorian studied her face, conflict evident in his expression. Finally, he nodded. Very well, but you will not go alone. I shall accompany you, with a sufficient guard to ensure your safety. Within the hour, the Duke's carriage was prepared for departure. As Liora settled into the velvet seat, memories of their first journey together flooded her mind. Her desperate flight, his unexpected kindness. Now they journeyed as husband and wife, bound by law, if not by affection. Dorian entered the carriage and took the seat opposite her, his face grim with purpose. We should reach Vale Manor by nightfall. With luck, we will not encounter Varnell's men on the road. Liora nodded, grateful for his protection, yet troubled by the distance that still yawned between them. As the carriage lurched into motion, she caught sight of a small silver object in his hand, a reliquary, she realized, similar to the miniature he had given her. What is that? She asked softly. His fingers closed around it protectively. Nothing of importance, but she had glimpsed its contents. A lock of dark hair too small to belong to a woman. A child's hair. His son's, perhaps, the infant who had died with Eleanor. The discovery pierced her heart with unexpected compassion. This man, so formidable in his power and reserve, carried his grief close to his skin. The carriage continued its journey through gathering storm clouds, carrying them toward Vale Manor, and whatever fate awaited there. As thunder rumbled in the distance, Dorian's gaze met hers across the narrow space, a glance of shared purpose if not yet understanding. You're safe, he said quietly, echoing his words from that first night. I will ensure it. In that moment, Liora believed him. Vale Manor loomed against the darkening sky, its once proud facade now crumbling with neglect. As the carriage approached, Liora felt the weight of memories press upon her. Childhood games in the overgrown garden, her mother's gentle laughter in the morning room, her father's gradual descent into dissolution after Elizabeth Vale's death. This had been her prison, then her escape, and now she returned as a duchess. It appears deserted, Dorian observed, his eyes scanning the silent house. No lamps illuminated the windows, no servants stood ready to greet them. Blackwood, proceed with caution. The carriage halted before the main entrance. Dorian descended first, then offered his hand to assist Liora. His touch was firm, steadying her as her slippers met the gravel drive. Together they mounted the worn stone steps, Blackwood and two armed footmen following closely behind. Liora's knock echoed ominously in the silence. After a long moment, shuffling footsteps approached, and the door creaked open to reveal Mrs. Whitcomb, the elderly housekeeper, who had been with the Vale family since before Liora's birth. Miss Liora, she gasped, her rheumy eyes widening in recognition. Oh, my dear girl. Or should I say your Grace now? She bobbed an awkward curtsy to Dorian, who acknowledged her with a nod. Mrs. Whitcomb, Liora said warmly, clasping the old woman's gnarled hands. How is my father? The housekeeper's face fell. Not well, miss. The doctor came and went, said there was nothing to be done but wait. He's in his chamber, hardly conscious. Her gaze darted nervously to Dorian. We weren't expecting... That is, the house is hardly prepared for a duke's visit. Never mind that, Dorian replied, his tone gentle despite his imposing presence. We are here for Lord Vale, nothing more. Mrs. Whitcomb led them through the dimly lit entrance hall, past tarnished mirrors and empty spaces where paintings had once hung. sold, no doubt, to satisfy Robert Vale's creditors or his thirst for spirits. The grand staircase creaked alarmingly as they ascended to the family quarters. The doctor said it was the drink that did it, Mrs. Whitcomb confided in a hushed voice. His lordship's liver, you see, failed him entirely. Leora's throat tightened with conflicting emotions. Pity for the broken man who had once been her father, anger at his self-destruction, guilt for her own absence. Beside her, Dorian's presence was a silent bulwark, his hand occasionally brushing hers as if to offer reassurance. Robert Vale's chamber was shrouded in shadow and the sour smell of illness. A single candle guttered beside the massive oak bed, where a wasted figure lay propped against yellowed pillows. Liora approached slowly, her heart pounding with dread and sorrow. "Father," she whispered, taking the skeletal hand that rested upon the coverlet. "It's Liora. I've come." Robert Vale's eyelids fluttered, then opened to reveal bloodshot eyes clouded with confusion. "Lisbeth?" he mumbled, his voice a dry rasp. "Come back to me." "No, father. It's Liora." She squeezed his hand gently. "Your daughter." Recognition slowly dawned in his bleary gaze. "Liora, you ran." His eyes shifted to Dorian, who stood a respectful distance behind her. "Took her. My property." Liora flinched at the word, but Dorian's expression remained impassive. "Lord Vale," he acknowledged with a slight bow, "I have come to pay my respects." "Respect?" Robert Vale's laugh dissolved into a fit of coughing that left his lips flecked with blood. "What respect does Carthorne owe me? You stole my daughter, my only asset." "I married your daughter," Dorian corrected, his voice calm, "with all legal propriety." "Legal?" Vale spat the word. "As if you cared for law, always watching, since Lisbeth died, waiting to take what was mine." Liora glanced at Dorian in confusion, but his face revealed nothing. "Father, please," she implored, turning back to the dying man. "Save your strength. I came to be with you, not to argue." Vale's grip on her hand suddenly tightened with surprising strength. "He didn't tell you," he wheezed. "Did he? About the letters? The money?" "What letters?" Liora asked, looking between her father and her husband. "What money?" "Your precious Duke," Vale continued, malice gleaming in his rheumy eyes, "has been paying our debts for years, behind my back, as if I were a child to be managed." He dissolved into another coughing fit. Dorian stepped forward, his face grave. "Perhaps this discussion should wait until Lord Vale has rested." "No." Vale struggled to sit upright, his wasted frame trembling with effort. "She should know. Know how he's been watching, following, writing to your mother. Even after she was mine." "Writing to my mother?" Liora echoed, her mind reeling. "But you said—" "I said I knew her," Dorian interrupted, his voice taut. "I did not specify the nature of our continued acquaintance." Vale's laughter was a terrible sound, half choked with blood and spite. "Acquaintance, is that what you call it? While my wife carried on a secret correspondence with the mighty Duke of Carthorne." He turned his fevered gaze to Liora. "He loved her, and she never loved me. Not once in 20 years. Liora felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath her feet. She looked to Dorian, silently pleading for denial, but found only grim confirmation in his eyes. "We were friends," Dorian said quietly. "Nothing more. I respected her marriage, as did she." "Liar," Vale hissed, his strength visibly ebbing. "I found the letters, after she died, hidden in her sewing box. Years of them." His fingers fumbled at his nightshirt, extracting a folded paper from some inner pocket. "Kept this one to remind me. Read it, Liora. Read what your mother wrote to him." With trembling hands, Liora accepted the yellowed paper. The handwriting was unmistakably her mother's, elegant and precise. "My dear friend, your offer of assistance touches me deeply, but I cannot accept. The path I have chosen, however difficult, is mine to walk. Robert is not the man I hoped he would be, but he is my husband and Leora's father. I made my vows before God, and I will honor them. What sustains me is knowing that should the worst befall me, you will watch over my daughter. Your promise in this regard is the greatest comfort a mother could wish for. With deepest gratitude, Elizabeth." The letter fell from Leora's numb fingers. She stared at Dorian, seeing him anew, not as her rescuer or reluctant husband, but as a man who had honored a decades-old promise to her mother, a man who had loved Elizabeth Vale from afar, respecting boundaries she herself had established. "You never told me," she whispered. "It was not my place to speak ill of your father," Dorian replied, his voice low, "or to complicate your memory of your mother." Robert Vale's breath came in labored gasps now, his moment of vindictive strength fading rapidly. "She never loved me," he repeated, his voice barely audible. "But you are mine, my daughter." Despite everything, Liora felt tears sting her eyes. "Yes, father, I am your daughter." She squeezed his hand gently. "Rest now." A rattling sigh escaped him, his eyelids drooping. "Forgive me," he murmured, the words so faint she nearly missed them. "For selling you, for failing her." Before Liora could respond, his hand went slack in hers. His chest rose once more, then fell silent. Robert Vale was gone. Mrs. Whitcomb appeared in the doorway, her ancient face solemn. "Is it done, then?" she asked, crossing herself. "The poor soul." Liora nodded, unable to speak through the knot of grief and confusion in her throat. Dorian stepped forward, gently drawing her away from the bedside. "Mrs. Whitcomb, please make the necessary arrangements," he instructed, his voice quiet but authoritative. "Blackwood will provide funds for a proper burial." The housekeeper nodded and withdrew, leaving them alone with the mortal remains of Robert Vale. Liora stood frozen, caught between grief for the father who had never truly loved her and shock at the revelations of his final moments. "Liora," Dorian began, his hand hovering near her shoulder, not quite touching. "What your father said, was it true?" she interrupted, turning to face him. "Did you love my mother?" The silence stretched between them, taut with unspoken truths. Outside, rain began to fall, pattering against the windows like phantom fingers. "Yes," he admitted finally, "I loved her. From a distance, with honor, knowing she could never be mine." "And that is why you married me? Out of obligation to her memory?" Dorian's expression softened, his customary reserve giving way to something more vulnerable. "I married you to protect you, as I promised her I would, but also because—" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Because in you I saw not just Elizabeth's daughter, but a woman of remarkable courage, a woman worth knowing for her own sake." Liora searched his face, seeking deception and finding only painful honesty. The ground beneath her had shifted irrevocably, her father dead, her mother's life revealed as more complex than she had ever imagined, and her marriage founded on a promise made long before she came of age. "I need time," she said quietly, "to understand all this, to grieve." "Of course." Dorian stepped back, respecting her need for distance. "We shall remain at Vale Manor until after the funeral. Then, if you wish, you may return to Carethorne Hall, or not. The choice will be yours." "And if I choose to leave? To make my own way?" His face was grave in the candlelight, shadows emphasizing the strong planes of his features. "Then I shall honor that choice, and ensure you have the means to do so comfortably. Our marriage contract guarantees your financial independence, regardless of where you reside." Before Liora could respond, Blackwood appeared at the door, his expression uncharacteristically troubled. "Your Grace," he said, addressing Dorian. "Riders approaching." Lord Varnell's livery. Dorian's posture shifted immediately, tension replacing solemnity. "How many?" "At least 6, possibly more behind them." "Secure the house," Dorian ordered. "No one enters without my express permission." As Blackwood hurried to obey, Dorian turned back to Liora. "It seems Varnell has learned of your father's death with remarkable speed. What does he want?" Liora asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. "With your father gone, he likely believes the marriage contract is his to enforce against the estate." Dorian's mouth set in a grim line. "He forgets that you are now my wife, and Vale Manor will pass to me as your husband." The implication struck Liora with sudden clarity. In the eyes of the law, everything that had been her father's, the manor, its lands, even his debts, now belonged to Dorian. She had escaped Varnell only to find herself equally powerless, albeit in more benevolent hands. "So I have traded one master for another," she said softly, the words escaping before she could reconsider them. Dorian's expression tightened, a flash of hurt quickly masked by his customary reserve. "Is that truly how you see me? As your master?" Before she could answer, the distant sound of shouting reached them, followed by the crack of what might have been a pistol shot. Varnell had not come merely to talk. "Stay here," Dorian instructed, striding toward the door. "Blackwood will ensure your safety." "Wait." Liora caught his arm, surprising herself with her boldness. "Be careful, please." For a moment, his stern facade softened. His hand covered hers briefly, warm and reassuring. "Always, my Duchess." Then he was gone, leaving Liora alone with her father's body and the echoing remnants of revelations that had shattered her understanding of the past. and perhaps her hope for the future. The cacophony below grew louder, men's voices raised in anger, the sound of furniture overturned, the unmistakable ring of steel against steel. Liora stood frozen beside her father's deathbed, torn between heeding Dorian's command to remain safely hidden and the desperate need to know what transpired. Duty won. She pulled a sheet over Robert Vale's still face, whispering a brief prayer for the troubled soul of the father who had failed her, yet in his final moments had sought forgiveness. The gesture complete, she crept to the door and eased it open, listening intently to the chaos echoing through Vale Manor. "Stand aside!" Varnell's voice bellowed from the entrance hall, the words slurred with what might have been drink or rage. "The girl belongs to me by right of contract." "The lady," came Dorian's measured reply, "is my wife and duchess. Your contract died with Lord Vale, as I believe my solicitor has already explained to you. Solicitors be damned, I paid good money, which has been returned to you in full," Dorian interrupted, his tone hardening. "Our business is concluded, Varnell. Depart my property before I have you removed forcibly." "Your property." Varnell's laugh held no humour. "Vale Manor belongs to Robert Vale's creditors, of which I am chief. The debts far exceed the worth of this crumbling pile." "The debts have been satisfied," Dorian replied calmly. "I purchased them from your associates yesterday. Every note, every mortgage, every lien against Vale Manor is now held by me." A shocked silence followed this revelation. Liora pressed her hand to her mouth, stifling a gasp. Dorian had purchased her father's debts, had known Robert Vale was dying even before the messenger arrived at Carethorne Hall. Had their journey here been orchestrated from the beginning? "Impossible," Varnell sputtered at last. "Clarence wouldn't sell for twice their face value. I assure you he would and did. As did Hargreaves and Bishop and every other parasite to whom Robert Vale owed so much as a farthing." The Duke's voice remained even, controlled, yet carried an undercurrent of steel. "Vale Manor and all its holdings now belong to my wife, free of encumbrance." Leora's heart stuttered in her chest. Not to him, but to her. How could this be when the law gave a husband total control over his wife's property? "You lie," Varnell hissed. "No woman can hold property independent of her husband." "A normal marriage settlement, perhaps," Dorian agreed, "but ours is hardly conventional. The contract specifically grants my wife full ownership of her inheritance, including any properties redeemed from debt during our marriage." Another silence, broken only by Varnell's labored breathing. When he spoke again, his voice dripped with venom. "You think you've won, Carethorne, but that chit isn't worth the trouble she'll bring you. I know her kind, frigid as her mother who spread her legs for Robert Vale only because she couldn't have you." The sound of a blow echoed through the hall, followed by a heavy thud. Liora pressed closer to the banister, peering down to see Varnell sprawled upon the marble floor, blood streaming from his nose. Dorian stood over him, his tall frame vibrating with barely contained fury. "Speak of my wife or her mother again," he said, his voice dangerously soft, "and I will forget I am a gentleman." Varnell struggled to his feet, dabbing at his bloody nose with a handkerchief. His small eyes glittered with hatred as he backed toward the door. "This isn't finished, Carethorne. No man humiliates me without consequence." "It is finished," Dorian replied. "And should you approach my wife again, the consequences will be yours alone to bear." Blackwood, see Lord Varnell to his carriage. Liora retreated from the banister, as Blackwood escorted the seething Varnell from Vale Manor. She returned to her father's room, her mind whirling with what she had overheard. Dorian had secured her inheritance, had given her independence in a world where women were legally bound to their husbands' wills. Why? What motivated such extraordinary generosity? She was seated beside her father's body, lost in thought, when Dorian appeared in the doorway. His cravat was askew, his knuckles raw from the encounter with Varnell, yet his expression softened as he regarded her. "You should not have had to hear that," he said quietly. "But I did," she replied, rising to face him. "Is it true? You purchased my father's debts?" Dorian nodded, entering the room with measured steps. "I began acquiring them shortly after our marriage. The process was nearly complete when we received word of your father's condition." "And you've placed Vale Manor in my name, not yours?" "As stipulated in our marriage contract," he confirmed. "Your property remains your own, to dispose of as you wish." Liora studied his face, searching for hidden motives in his impassive features. "Why would you do this? What benefit could it possibly bring you?" For a moment, Dorian seemed to struggle with himself, his customary reserve warring with some deeper emotion. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of sincerity she had not heard before. "Because it was right," he said simply. "Because you deserve the freedom to choose your own path, unencumbered by either your father's debts or a husband's authority. Even if that path leads away from you?" The question hung between them, fragile and momentous. Dorian's gaze never left hers as he stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of darker grey in his eyes, like storm clouds gathering. "Even then," he answered softly, "though I confess I would regret it deeply." Leora's breath caught. "You would?" "More than I have words to express." His hand rose as if to touch her face, then dropped back to his side. "But I will not hold you by obligation or gratitude, Liora. When we return to Carethorne Hall, you may remain as my wife in truth rather than merely name, or you may establish yourself separately with my full support. The choice must be yours." The sincerity in his voice staggered her. This man who had rescued her from Varnell, who had honored a promise to her mother beyond all reasonable obligation, who now offered her freedom when the law granted him absolute authority, this man was offering her a choice that few women of her era would ever know. "I need time," she whispered, "to mourn my father, to understand what all this means." "Of course." He stepped back, respecting her need for space. "We shall remain at Vale Manor until after the funeral. Then, whatever you decide, I will honor it." A knock at the door interrupted them. Mrs. Whitcomb entered, followed by two somber-faced women from the village. "For the laying out, Your Grace," the housekeeper explained. "If you'd both like to wait downstairs, we'll see to his lordship now." Liora nodded gratefully and allowed Dorian to escort her from the chamber. As they descended the grand staircase, his hand beneath her elbow steady and warm, she found herself studying him anew, not as her rescuer or reluctant husband, but as a man who had loved her mother enough to protect her daughter without expectation of reward. "There is much I still don't understand," she said, as they reached the entrance hall, where signs of the confrontation with Varnell had already been cleared away. "About my mother, about you. Ask what you will," Dorian replied. "I shall answer with complete honesty. The miniature you gave me, did she leave it with you before her marriage to my father?" A shadow crossed his face. "No. She sent it to me after you were born, with a letter explaining that she had named you Liora Elizabeth, Liora for her grandmother, Elizabeth for herself." His voice softened with memory. "She wrote that should anything happen to her, I would recognize her daughter by the resemblance to the portrait." "And when she died?" Liora pressed. "I tried to intervene," Dorian admitted. "I offered your father financial assistance anonymously at first, then directly. He refused, preferring to sink further into debt and dissolution." A muscle tightened in his jaw. "I could do nothing but watch from a distance until he signed the contract with Varnell," Liora finished. Dorian nodded grimly. "Even then, I had hoped to find a less permanent solution than marriage, but circumstances forced my hand." They had reached the morning room, a chamber less touched by neglect than the rest of Vale Manor. Pale sunlight filtered through tattered curtains, illuminating faded furnishings that Liora remembered from childhood. Here, her mother had taught her to read and sew, had told her stories of brave heroines and noble knights. "She never told me," Liora murmured, running her fingers along the spinet that had fallen silent with Elizabeth Vale's death. "About you, about her unhappiness. She wouldn't have burdened a child with such knowledge," Dorian said gently. "She protected you as best she could, as she would have wished me to protect you after she was gone." "And now?" Liora turned to face him fully. "Now that you have fulfilled your promise to her, what do you wish?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. For a moment, the careful mask he wore for the world slipped, revealing a vulnerability that stole her breath. "I wish," he began, then faltered. Drawing a steadying breath, he tried again. "I wish for your happiness, Liora, whether that includes me or not." Outside the window, the first rays of sunset painted the neglected gardens in hues of gold and amber. Tomorrow would bring the solemn business of her father's burial, the formal transfer of Vale Manor to her name, decisions that could not be undone. But in this quiet moment, with the truth finally laid bare between them, Liora felt the first tentative stirrings of something she had not dared to hope for, not merely safety, but the possibility of joy. The morning of Robert Vale's funeral dawned clear and cool, autumn sunlight gilding the weathered gravestones in the small churchyard, where generations of Vales had been laid to rest. Liora stood beside the open grave, a solitary figure in widow's weeds borrowed hastily from Mrs. Whitcomb's niece. The irony did not escape her, a bride and widow both, though only one title was genuine. Dorian stood a respectful distance behind her, his tall figure commanding even in stillness. The handful of villagers and tenant farmers who had come to pay their respects cast curious glances at the Duke, their whispers carrying in the quiet air. Who would have imagined that Miss Liora, who had fled her own wedding, would return as a duchess with one of England's most formidable peers as her husband? Reverend Clarkson, who had christened Liora 21 years earlier, spoke the burial service with sonorous dignity. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, in sure and certain hope of resurrection to eternal life. The familiar words washed over her, bringing neither comfort nor additional pain, merely a sense of completion. One chapter closing, another yet to be written. When the simple service concluded, Dorian stepped forward to stand beside her as the mourners filed past, offering awkward condolences. His presence steadied her, a silent bulwark against well-meaning but intrusive curiosity. Only when the last villager had departed did he speak. "Are you ready to return to the house?" he asked, his voice gentle. Liora shook her head. "Not yet. There is something I must do first." Understanding without further explanation, he nodded and withdrew to the lich gate, where Blackwood waited with the carriage. Liora watched him go, struck again by the contradiction he presented, a man of rigid control and unexpected compassion, who offered protection without demanding surrender. Turning back to the freshly turned earth of her father's grave, she knelt and placed a single white rose upon it. "Goodbye, father," she whispered. "May you find the peace that eluded you in life." Rising, she moved to another grave nearby, its headstone weathered but well tended, despite the general neglect of Vale Manor. "Elizabeth Vale, beloved wife and mother," the inscription read. "Born 1798, died 1834. The dates told their own stark story. Dead at 36, leaving a 10-year-old daughter to a father ill-equipped for either parenthood or widowhood. Liora traced the carved letters with gentle fingers. "I understand better now, mother," she murmured. "The choices you made, the sacrifices." A shadow fell across the grave as Dorian approached, his expression solemn. In his hand he carried a small bouquet of late-blooming violets. "May I?" he asked quietly. At Liora's nod, he knelt and placed the flowers beside the headstone, his movements reverent. "She favored violets," he explained, rising. "Even in India I remembered that." "You loved her very much," Liora observed. Not a question, but a recognition. "I did." He met her gaze directly. "But not as you might imagine. We were never lovers, Liora. Our connection was one of kindred spirits, two souls who recognized in each other a shared understanding of duty and sacrifice." "Yet you promised to protect her daughter," Liora pressed. "A promise you have honored beyond any reasonable obligation." Dorian's gaze returned to the grave, his profile sharp against the autumn sky. "Your mother saved me from despair when I was little more than a boy, facing a future I neither wanted nor understood. Her wisdom gave me courage to embrace my duty with honor rather than resentment. When she wrote to me of her own unhappy circumstance, how could I do less for her than she had done for me?" A complex emotion rose in Liora's chest, gratitude mingled with something deeper, something she was not yet ready to name. "And now? Now that you have fulfilled that promise?" For a long moment Dorian said nothing, his face unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of carefully measured truth. "Now I find myself bound by a different promise, the one I made to you as your husband, to protect and honor you not out of obligation to your mother's memory, but for your own sake." The sincerity in his voice stole her breath. Before she could respond, the church bell tolled the hour, breaking the intimate silence between them. "We should return to the house," Dorian said, offering his arm. "Solicitor Graves will be arriving to discuss the settlement of your father's estate." Liora placed her hand upon his sleeve, allowing him to escort her from the churchyard. As they approached the carriage, a thought occurred to her. "The estate is entailed, is it not? Without a male heir, will it not pass to some distant cousin?" "Ordinarily, yes," Dorian acknowledged as he handed her into the carriage. "However, your father broke the entail 5 years ago to secure a loan from Lord Hargreaves. The property is now unentailed, and as we discussed, belongs to you free and clear, thanks to my purchase of the outstanding debts." The carriage set off toward Vale Manor, rocking gently on its springs. Liora studied Dorian's profile, marveling at the thoroughness of his preparations. "You seem to have thought of everything," she observed. "Not everything," he replied, a hint of wryness entering his voice. "I failed to anticipate how quickly Varnell would move once your father's death was known, or how violently he would react to being thwarted." "Do you believe he poses a continued threat?" Dorian's expression hardened. "Varnell is a dangerous man, particularly when his pride is wounded. Until I can neutralize his influence completely, we must remain vigilant." "We," Liora echoed softly. "You speak as though my decision is already made." His gaze met hers across the carriage, intent, yet carefully neutral. "Is it not? I promised you the freedom to choose your path, Liora. That promise stands regardless of Varnell or any other threat." Before she could respond, the carriage turned into the drive of Vale Manor, where a nondescript curricle awaited. Solicitor Graves arrived to execute the formal transfer of property. The moment for personal truths had passed, replaced by the practical business of inheritance. The meeting proceeded with brisk efficiency in Robert Vale's neglected study. Graves, a thin man with spectacles perched upon a beak-like nose, presented the documents with minimal commentary, clearly awed by the Duke's presence. "Everything appears to be in order, Your Grace," he said, passing the final paper for Dorian's signature. "With these documents filed, the property passes to Her Grace completely and without reservation." Dorian signed without hesitation, then slid the document toward Liora. "Your signature, my dear, to complete the transfer." Liora stared at the parchment, its legal language confirming what still seemed impossible. Vale Manor, with its lands and remaining assets, now belonged solely to her, protected from both her husband's control and Varnell's grasping hands. "This is most irregular," Graves muttered as she signed her name with steady hand. "A woman holding property independent of her husband is perfectly legal when the husband so chooses," Dorian interrupted smoothly. "A progressive arrangement perhaps, but hardly unprecedented." When Graves had departed, bearing the signed documents to be properly registered, Liora turned to Dorian with renewed wonder. "You have given me something most women never know, true independence." "I have merely recognized what should be your natural right," he replied. "The question remains, what will you do with this freedom?" The question hung between them, momentous and unresolved. Outside, the afternoon light was fading, shadows lengthening across the overgrown gardens of Vale Manor. "I believe," Liora said carefully, "that I would like to return to Carethorne Hall. With you." Something flickered in Dorian's eyes. Relief, perhaps, or the beginning of hope. "As my Duchess in name only, or as your wife," she interrupted softly. "In truth, not merely appearance, if that is what you wish as well." For a moment, Dorian's customary reserve cracked entirely, revealing a vulnerability that caught at her heart. His hand reached for hers, hesitant in a way she had never witnessed from this most controlled of men. "It is what I have wished since the moment you entered my carriage in the rain," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. Soaked and terrified, yet facing me with such courage that I knew my heart was lost. Liora entwined her fingers with his, feeling the calluses that belied his aristocratic appearance, evidence of a man who had known both privilege and hardship. "I was running from one fate, only to find another I could never have imagined." "And do you regret it?" he asked, his grey eyes searching hers. "Our hasty marriage, the circumstances that forced us together?" "No," she answered truthfully. "How could I regret the path that led me to truly know you, not as my rescuer or my mother's friend, but as the man you are, honorable, even when honor demands sacrifice?" Dorian raised their joined hands, pressing a kiss to her knuckles with a reverence that made her breath catch. "Then let us return to Carethorne Hall, my Duchess, not as reluctant allies, but as husband and wife in every sense." As they prepared to depart Vale Manor, perhaps for the final time, Liora paused in the entrance hall, looking back at the house that had been both haven and prison throughout her childhood. Whatever the future held at Carethorne Hall, she would face it not as a frightened girl fleeing an unwanted marriage, but as a woman who had chosen her own path, her own husband, her own destiny. Outside, the Duke's carriage waited, no longer a symbol of flight but of journey, a journey they would now undertake together. Spring arrived at Carethorne Hall with unexpected gentleness, coaxing green shoots from soil long dormant and painting the formal gardens with delicate colour. Liora stood at the edge of the cliff path, watching as waves crashed against the rocks below, their fury transformed to lace and mist in the morning light. The wind tugged at her hair, loosening strands from their pins to dance around her face like autumn leaves. 6 months had passed since her father's funeral, since her return to Carethorne Hall, not as a refugee, but as a wife by choice rather than necessity. 6 months of learning the contours of a marriage begun in crisis and transformed by gradual, deliberate understanding. 6 months of discovering that Dorian Carethorne, for all his formidable reputation, was a man capable of tenderness so acute it sometimes brought tears to her eyes. "I thought I might find you here." His voice came from behind her, familiar now in its depth and careful precision. "You favor this spot above all others." Liora turned to greet him, smiling at the sight of his tall figure silhouetted against the pale spring sky. "It reminds me that some forces cannot be controlled, only respected. Like the sea. A lesson I have been slow to learn," he acknowledged, moving to stand beside her at the cliff's edge. His hand found hers, their fingers entwining with the easy intimacy that had grown between them. "The household is in an uproar preparing for tonight's gathering. Mrs. Winters sent me to inquire if you had any final instructions regarding the dining arrangements." "Everything is in hand," Liora assured him, leaning slightly into his solid warmth. "Though I confess I'm rather nervous about our first formal entertainment as host and hostess. The neighborhood has been desperate for an invitation to Carethorne Hall for years," Dorian said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "They would come if we served nothing but gruel and weak tea." "Yes, but their curiosity is primarily about you, my love, the reclusive duke who suddenly acquired a wife and now opens his home to society. They will be watching for any hint of scandal or impropriety." "Let them watch," he replied with surprising lightness. "What will they see but a man devoted to his duchess? Hardly the stuff of gossip." Liora smiled, warmed by his words despite the brisk sea air. "They will see a changed man, I think. Not the fearsome Duke of Carethorne they have whispered about these many years." "Changed, yes," he agreed, his grey eyes softening as they regarded her. "Though perhaps not so much changed as revealed. You have seen what others have not troubled to look for, Liora." She reached up to touch his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "As you have seen me, not as Robert Vale's daughter or Elizabeth's child, but as myself." The months since their return from Vale Manor had brought changes both subtle and profound. The silent corridors of Carethorne Hall now resonated with purpose as Liora undertook renovations long neglected. Guest rooms shuttered since Eleanor's death were opened and refurbished. The portrait gallery was rearranged, with Elizabeth Vale's miniature given a place of honor alongside images of Dorian's ancestors. Most significantly, the separate chambers that had defined their early marriage had gradually merged, until the connecting door between the Duke's apartments and the Duchess's suite remained permanently open. What had begun as tentative courtship, stolen kisses in the library, hands meeting over breakfast, whispered confidences in firelit darkness, had blossomed into a passion neither had anticipated when they spoke their hasty vows. "I have something for you," Dorian said now, reaching into his coat pocket. "A gift to mark 6 months since you chose to be my wife in truth as well as name." He withdrew a small velvet box, offering it with a solemnity that made her heart quicken. Inside, nestled on black velvet, lay a ring of platinum and sapphires, delicate yet striking in its craftsmanship. "Oh, Dorian," she breathed, touching the gleaming stones with reverent fingers. "It's beautiful." "To replace the borrowed ring from our wedding day," he explained, removing it from the box. "May I?" Liora nodded, extending her left hand where Blackwood's widow's ring still circled her fourth finger, too large and secured with a twist of silk thread. Dorian removed it gently, then slid the sapphire band in its place, a perfect fit as if made for her hand alone. "There," he said softly. "Now when people see the Duchess of Carethorne, they will know she is cherished not out of obligation, but love." The word hung between them, not for the first time but never without weight. Love, what had begun as duty, transformed by choice and understanding into something neither had dared hope for in those first desperate days. "Speaking of being seen," Liora said, turning the ring so that sunlight caught the deep blue stones, "there is a matter I've been meaning to discuss with you, regarding tonight's gathering." "Oh?" Dorian's eyebrow arched in question. "Have you changed the menu after all? Mrs. Winters will have apoplexy if you've altered her carefully planned courses." "Not the menu," she laughed, then grew serious once more. "It's about Lord and Lady Harrington. I've invited them specifically because their eldest daughter, Emily, has recently been jilted by a gentleman who discovered her family's finances were not as robust as he had been led to believe. Understanding dawned in Dorian's eyes, and you wish to show her kindness, to demonstrate that worth is not measured by dowry or connections." "Yes," Liora squeezed his hand gratefully, "but there's more. I've taken the liberty of inviting Captain James as well. You remember him from the regiment? Blackwood's protégé." Dorian nodded. "A good man, if somewhat lacking in fortune." "A good man is precisely what Miss Harrington needs, Not another fortune hunter, Liora asserted, and I thought perhaps, that is, I wondered if you might speak with him during the evening. Mention that while Miss Harrington's dowry is modest, her character is exceptional. A slow smile spread across Dorian's face, warming his usually solemn features. My Duchess turns matchmaker. How very traditional of you. Not matchmaking, she protested with mock indignation, merely creating favorable conditions for mutual discovery. As were created for us? He asked, suddenly serious again, though under rather more dramatic circumstances. Indeed. Leora's hand rested unconsciously on her abdomen, a gesture that did not escape Dorian's notice. His eyes widened slightly, a question forming in their depths. Liora, he said carefully, is there something you wish to tell me? She had planned to wait until after the dinner party to create a perfect moment for such momentous news. But here, with the sea spread before them and the spring sun warm upon their faces, she found she could not delay. Dr. Morrison confirmed it yesterday, she said softly. We are to have a child, Dorian, by autumn's end. For a moment he stood frozen, as if unable to comprehend her words. Then, with a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob, he gathered her into his arms, holding her as though she were made of the most precious porcelain. A child, he whispered against her hair. Our child. The wonder in his voice brought tears to her eyes. She knew what this meant to him. A second chance at fatherhood after the devastating loss of Eleanor and their infant son. A hope he had abandoned until she entered his life. Are you pleased? She asked, drawing back to search his face. Pleased, he echoed incredulously. Liora, my love, you have given me more than I ever dared hope for. First your trust, then your heart, and now, his hand covered hers where it rested upon her still flat abdomen. Now, this miracle. They stood together at the cliff's edge, the future spreading before them like the endless sea. Below, waves crashed against unyielding stone, their force transformed into something beautiful by the very resistance they encountered. Like their own journey, Liora thought, what had begun in storm and flight had been transformed through challenge and choice into something neither could have imagined on that rain-soaked night when she had tried to flee a wedding carriage, only to find unexpected sanctuary in the arms of a duke. As spring sunlight gilded Carriage Hall behind them, Dorian drew her close once more, his lips finding hers in a kiss that spoke of promises kept and new ones yet to be made. When they parted, his smile held all the warmth that had once seemed impossible from the stern Duke of Carriage. Come, my Duchess, he said, offering his arm with courtly grace. We have a future to prepare for, and guests arriving in a few hours who will be most disappointed if we are not properly attired to receive them. Liora placed her hand upon his sleeve, the sapphires on her finger catching the light like captured stars. Lead on, my Duke. I follow where you go. No, he corrected gently. We walk together, as equals, as we have since the moment you chose to stay. Together they turned toward Carriage Hall, its windows gleaming with welcome in the spring sunshine. No longer a refuge of last resort, but a home being transformed by love, choice, and the courage to begin anew. Behind them, the carriage that had once been her salvation faded into memory, replaced by the promise of journeys yet to come, journeys they would undertake not in desperate flight, but in hopeful companionship. For sometimes the greatest freedom comes not from escape, but from the choice to remain where one is truly valued, truly seen, and truly loved. In the quiet chambers of our hearts, we all seek the same truth, that safety is not merely the absence of danger, but the presence of someone who sees us completely and loves us nonetheless. Liora and Dorian's journey reminds us that true freedom comes not from escape, but from the courage to choose connection, even when past wounds urge us toward solitude. Their story teaches us that the most profound protection we can offer another is not control disguised as care, but rather the respect that grants them agency over their own destiny. When Dorian gave Liora independence within their marriage, a radical act in their time, he demonstrated that real love empowers rather than diminishes. Perhaps most importantly, this tale whispers to us that redemption is always possible, that hearts calcified by grief can soften again under the gentle persistence of compassion. The walls we build for protection need not become our prisons. They can be dismantled, stone by stone, by those patient enough to see the light still flickering within. May we all find the courage to flee what diminishes us, to recognize the whispered promise of safety when it is genuinely offered, and to build relationships where protection and freedom exist not in opposition, but in harmonious balance. If this tale of courage, redemption, and love against all odds has touched your heart, I invite you to join our community of romantic souls. Subscribe to our channel to receive more enchanting Victorian love stories that will transport you to worlds where honor and passion dance in delicate balance. Did your heart race when the Duke whispered, "You're safe now"? Did you hold your breath when Liora made her final choice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me which moment moved you most, or which character's journey resonated with your own. Your words inspire new tales and connect us all in the timeless language of romance. Until our next journey together, remember that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with an act of courage, whether fleeing a wedding carriage or opening your heart to unexpected possibilities.